The amount of expenses that small businesses have had to incur in 2023 have killed all profitability to small business.
You're stressed out, you get tired. What you're supposed to get, you're always thinking, instead of thinking about the business, you're thinking how I'm supposed to come up with this money.
That ripple effect, the cascading effect of this is significantly more than just that one business.
I'm not jumping on any government bashing bandwagon. That said, it would be, if the government can find a way to extend it, it would be great for us.
Time's up for small businesses who took out emergency government loans during the pandemic. Those loans were free from interest and a big chunk of them forgivable until tomorrow.
We understand that things, even as the economy has bounced back from COVID, continue to be challenging, which is why we extended twice the repayment deadline for the CEBA loans. But we are now far enough from the pandemic that we do have to wrap up pandemic programs. If they can't quite make it by the 18th, there are plenty of financial institutions who are there to give low-cost loans to be able to benefit those businesses as they continue to repay it over the coming years.
As you heard the Prime Minister mention, the feds have twice extended the deadline to repay without penalty, but so far do not look like they're going to heed calls from struggling businesses to do so a third time. After tomorrow, businesses that haven't paid their loans back will start to accrue interest. So what's the fallout like for the government, or is the Prime Minister right to double down on this? Let's bring in the front bench to talk about that. Elliot Hughes is a political commentator and senior associate with Summa Strategies. He's a former senior advisor to Liberal finance and defense ministers. Denise CLA is with Hill Solutions. She was a former press secretary in the Conservative Leader's office. Kathleen Monk is the former director of communications to the late Jack Layton. She's now the principal owner of Monk and Associates. And Sabrina Nanji is the founder of Queen's Park Observer, where she is a journalist. Hello, everyone. Happy Wednesday, I guess, middle of the week. Kathleen, I'll start with you. There's a political dynamic to this as well. The NDP federally have really been asking the government and pushing the government, attempting to push the government to extend this deadline for a third time. The premiers, all 13 of them, got together and wrote a letter asking for the same thing. Why do you think the government has made the calculation not to do so?
Well, I think because they want a coherent strategy. And Prime Minister Trudeau hasn't had a lot of those coherent strategies lately. They want to avoid getting into the same kind of communications trap that they have on so many other things, like the carbon tax, right? So him doubling down this morning, I think is a good thing. You know, he's trying to show some fiscal responsibility, consistent in his strategy. And frankly, he has the ability to do so. Why? Because the Conservatives have been silent. They've said nothing on this. They haven't gone out. They haven't advocated for small businesses. I'm sure, as you point out, the premiers have. And the NDP has. But the NDP has always been on the side of kind of mom and pop shops, right? They were the ones that advocated for the lowering of the small business tax years ago. And so they've been pushing for this extension of the CEBA loan, just like you see Wap Canoe in Manitoba actually lowering the hydro rates, for freezing the hydro rates for small businesses. So there's that thread, populist kind of thread within the NDP that they've always kind of been on the side of those small business owners. And so they're pushing for that. But for the Liberals, it makes sense. And they have no competition on this one issue, because the Conservatives are not giving them a hard time.
Maybe perhaps, Denise, the only cost of living issue right now that the Conservatives aren't giving them a hard time on. Do you think that is the calculation for the government? And why do you think the Conservatives are pretty silent on this one?
Well, the silence actually speaks to the fact that this is something that the Conservatives had wanted in terms of ensuring, look, let's get support for small businesses. And when you borrow the money, you got to pay it back. So the fiscal conservative part of things makes sense. And I would imagine that out of the 900 approximately 1,000 businesses that have had the opportunity for these loans, a large percentage of them are on path to pay it back. So the interest rates will accrue starting tomorrow. But look, we're talking about the ways in which we get mom and pop shops the support that they need, and when they're back on their feet, let's start to employ more Canadians. And so perhaps it's the fiscal part of it.
I think that the argument, at least from a lot of small businesses who make up the 30% of the hundreds of, I think it was 900,000, who have yet to pay back, Elliot, is that they're just not able to, right? That recovery has been uneven, largely dependent on what the impact of a lockdown was on your business, and that there's a whole lot of other things going on, including a slowdown in the economy due to higher interest rates that are also having an impact and making it harder for them to pay back the loan by this deadline. Is there a crass political calculation at any point by any of the parties right now on the value of the small business vote, do you think?
I was thinking about this, actually reflecting how, aside from this issue, we really haven't heard a lot from the small business community since the pandemic started to sort of fade. I remember, for several years, and Kathleen touched on this point, it was a big fight. It was a big political fight for years and years and years of which party is more friendly to small business. It was an important constituency, and that's largely gone away. So I think that's an interesting thing to watch in 2024. Does it come back? Are they important again? But obviously, as you point out, Vashi, no one wants to see any small business sort of suffer and be in trouble financially. And so that's why the government has been so flexible and so supportive of them over the last couple of years since the pandemic, and continues, as the Prime Minister points out, to provide lots of pathways for them to be able to pay these loans back. So 70% of those who wanted that $20K forgiveness on the $60,000 loan have already paid it back in full, which is actually a pretty solid number. I don't think there's really crass politics at play here. I think from the folks who have just sort of commented on this, it doesn't seem like one of those tough political issues. I think it's one of those things that the Prime Minister has decided, look, we need to move on from this. The COVID supports were very healthy and strong for a long time, but it's time to pay those loans back. And the last point, by not paying them, if you don't pay them back, you're sort of, it's unfair to the companies who actually have done so. And so it's time to move on, and hopefully these businesses can continue to succeed in 2024.
Yeah, I think Elliot's right that there's a large public sentiment that pandemic supports do need to be paid back. I think, still speaking to small business owners, it's not necessarily explicitly tied, Sabrina, to the pandemic, but there is a sense that all levels of government don't necessarily have their back. I think that's true. A lot of small business owners feel like they're not represented in government, but putting that aside for a second, I think we're the only place that the government gets in some tricky water when they use the fiscal responsibility argument is that there are other levers at their disposal. And I brought this up to the minister earlier, particularly focused on bigger corporations, like their threats to levy a tax on grocery stores that don't stabilize prices. They haven't added any meat to that threat in the months since they made it, or even being more ardent about going after the wage subsidy and some of the potential flags that the Auditor General raised in about $15 billion of concerns she had about how that money was spent. They're not doing that.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to something we might talk about a little bit later, which is the caucus retreat coming up and the emphasis on the economy and cost of living and dealing with those issues, because I think the Trudeau government definitely wants to be seen as, taking action on that, where, people and polls suggest that they haven't been performing so hot on those issues. But I think death, taxes, and government loan repayments, those are three things you just can't escape. It's coming down. And I would just add, I think my co-panelists have really pointed out, hit the nail on the head here when it comes to the main issues here. But I think one thing that's helping to soften the blow with maybe public perception of these loan repayments, and especially for struggling businesses, especially in the restaurant industry, which, first was dealing with COVID and now cost of living and people, not going out to eat as much, I think is Trudeau framing this that the COVID era program needs to come to an end at some point. And everyone is probably happy to hear that COVID is behind us, the brunt of it is in the rear view mirror. And so I think that the framing of this is also playing a factor in how it's going to play out with the public.
I think that's a great point, and sort of jumps off of what Denise, you were saying about perhaps that's the reason why we're not hearing anything from the Conservatives on this one. I'm going to take a quick break. The front bench is sticking around. Sabrina, telegraph what we're talking about next. The cabinet retreat in Montreal in a few days, what they have to accomplish politically at that retreat, and the pressures they're up against. We're talking about that with the front bench next.